Hi, everyone. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the president's greatest hits. But what we're going to do in this time is we're going to go through the slides. We're going to do this for the visual learners who like to see some of the pictures, have like a face for the names. We're not going to have the answer key in this lesson at all. That's the other video for the textual learners. And hopefully between the two, you get what you need. So here we go. And let's see if this is working. So Harry Truman is the president at the end of World War II. He was FDR's vice president. We have lots of information about him. But what we want to focus on is not just his major international impact, such as authorizing the use of atomic weapons against Japan and the Second World War, but also taking a look at his domestic policies. So one thing that you're going to see in this video is you're going to need to stop and pause. You're going to probably have a lot of information on screen. You're going to take in these images. You maybe even want to pause when we're going through some of the slides more quickly, because we want this to be a quick video. Not everyone needs all this information, but you certainly should pause if you see something interesting to you. That's how you'll really learn. So in July of 1948, President Truman issues an executive order, Executive Order 9981. This desegregates the armed forces. This ends segregation in the military. It's a major victory for the civil rights movement, even before civil rights movement has really taken up steam. Something you don't need to know, but it's cool. Then, in the election of 1948, Harry Truman is supposed to lose this election because Thomas Dewey, the Republican, is very popular, and the Democratic Party is split between the Southern Democrats, led by Strom Thurmond, and Harry Truman. So you have these four candidates, and no one expects Truman's going to win. That's why on November 3rd, 1948, when many newspapers had already called the election, Dewey actually did not defeat Truman. You don't always want to believe the hype. So Truman was elected against all odds in 1948. Then, in 1952, there is a steel strike. During the Korean War, over 500,000 steel workers tried to go on strike. So President Truman authorizes a takeover of the steel mills to nationalize the steel industry and prevent those strikes from taking place. But this Supreme Court case, the Youngstown Sheet Company versus Sawyer, it's actually not 1951, it's 1952, rules that Truman's actions were unconstitutional. He could not seize this private property without congressional approval. And so it's a limit on the president's powers over labor. You should also know that during Truman's presidency, the second Red Scare really gained steam, this paranoia of communism, these Joe McCarthy witch hunts of looking for spies and government officials who were suspected of being communists. This really starts in Truman's campaign, but continues into Eisenhower's campaign. So again, you should pause, maybe go back on the video if you want to. Eisenhower was president from 53 to 61. He was a war hero and general from World War II. And the Red Scare continues in Eisenhower's administration. This is more McCarthyism, the Rosenberg trial and execution in Ossining, New York. And then finally, Joseph McCarthy really angers many in the United States government. The Army McCarthy hearings in April, May, June of 1954 are these televised hearings that really expose that Senator McCarthy does not have any real evidence to back up his aggressive claims and tactics. McCarthy is censured and eventually loses power and leaves in disgrace. You should also know that President Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. The Warren Court is going to be a very, very influential court in the United States, such as in the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, ruling segregation in schools, public schools, to be unconstitutional. And the Warren Court is going to be influential throughout the 1950s and 60s. So it's a lingering impact of Eisenhower's administration. You also have the Federal Highway Act. In 1956, There's authorization of the construction of the interstate highway system, combining old state and local roads and making a major lasting impact on infrastructure in the U.S. So move this. Move this over here. Yeah, let's move this way. Also, in addition to Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, there is also the Little Rock Nine. The Little Rock Nine are a group of 9 African American students who tried to integrate the Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. When they're blocked by the Arkansas governor, President Eisenhower sends in federal troops to escort the students to school, really standing up for integration and opposing segregation publicly and militarily. Alaska and Hawaii also become states, no longer territories in Eisenhower's administration. And in his last effort as president, on January 1961, Eisenhower gives his farewell address where he warns against the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower warns about the growing influence of defense contractors and the over-reliance America seems to have in supporting its military defense industries. Eisenhower is really warning that the military-industrial complex could lead to problems in America as the military and politicians and the public and the economy all reinforce one another, but to what ends and to what losses. Then next, that's not JFK, that's his brother, that's my bad. Then you have JFK. He is a popular Democrat from Massachusetts, and he becomes president partly because in 1960, during his presidential debate with Richard Nixon, these are the first televised presidential debates. This enhances JFK's public image and really leads to JFK becoming elected. JFK is also really the face of the space race in a lot of ways. He makes several speeches. He pushes for greater funding for colleges, for the National Defense and Education Act, for the organization that will become NASA and the Apollo programs. So JFK is a major space race face. There's also the March on Washington in JFK's presidency. Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his famous I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in front of the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. And it's important to notice that President JFK was a real supporter of civil rights. JFK and his Democratic Party had really decided to support different civil rights legislation, civil rights amendments, and these are things that are going to be carried over into Lyndon Johnson's presidency, because even though he supported the civil rights movement, JFK is assassinated while driving in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas in November 1963. His assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, is assassinated 2 days later by Jack Ruby, leaving a lot of questions about the assassination and its motives. Next, and right, you might have to go back, pause, it's fine. You have Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was JFK's vice president. Here he is being sworn in on Air Force One, the same day Lincoln is assassinated. And one of LBJ's big efforts was his Great Society program. This, similar to the New Deal, sought to end poverty, to improve the quality of life around America, and several programs like the Head Start programs, Medicaid and Medicare, and public broadcasting programs were really a passion President Johnson had to try to improve America. There's also the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This ends public discrimination based on race, sex, but also color, national origin, and religion. This is some landmark legislation that you need to know. There were questions if LBJ would continue this JFK initiative, but it is done. There's also the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In August of 1964, Congress authorizes President LBJ to use military force more extensively throughout Vietnam, even without a formal declaration of war. This expansion of the president's military control and this decrease in Congress's military oversight lasts for 9 years until the War Powers Act in 1973. Medicare and Medicaid, how are they different? These are two programs created in the Great Society. Medicare is for people over 65 years old. It's a federal program. And Medicare, even though it has 4 parts, helps pay for many different medical benefits once you hit 65 and over. Medicaid, on the other hand, is a federal and state assistance program. It depends how much income you make and what your state thresholds are, but you can use Medicaid to pay for your bills if you qualify before you're 65 years old. There's also the 24th Amendment. In January of 1964, the federal 24th Amendment outlaws poll taxes in federal elections. You don't need to vote. You don't need to pay to vote for the president or vice president or Congress anymore. There's also the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is a major effort of the civil rights movement. This really prohibits racial discrimination in voting, or enforces the 15th Amendment by outlawing literacy tests, putting federal examiners at local and state elections, and helping eliminate the poll tax at the state and local levels, also making it easier to register to vote. Then, in 1965, also, Lyndon Johnson at Ellis Island, New York, signs the Immigration and Nationality Act. This was a way of getting rid of the race-based quotas. There are going to still be number quotas on the number of immigrants coming into the United States, but no longer is it determined based off of previous numbers how many people get in from which countries. This really opens the door to more immigration from Asia, Latin America, but also Africa as well, as these quotas are no more. But Lyndon Johnson's use of a draft and wide expansion of the Vietnam War is a major issue that he cannot escape. There are going to be severe and even worldwide protests against the Vietnam War that ultimately lead President Johnson to not seek re-election in 1968. Instead, both Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy are going to run for the Democratic Party. There's going to be a lot of political protests and upheaval in 1968. Before the presidential election can get really underway, Robert Kennedy is assassinated. MLK Jr. is also assassinated. There are race riots and also peace protests in the summer of 1968. This sets the stage for Richard Nixon to be elected president. Nixon's a Republican, and he's going to be known for a few things, namely Vietnamization. Nixon is going to use the Air Force in secret bombing campaigns against Cambodia and Laos and North Vietnam, but he is also going to reduce the number of troops, American troops, in Vietnam. He's going to turn the Vietnam War over to the South Vietnamese, and that's why this effort of Vietnamization ultimately results in a ceasefire and withdrawing U.S. troops from the Vietnam War, but eventually, not immediately. President Nixon also creates the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. It creates a new cabinet post and a new environmental administrator as the environment was becoming more of an issue that needed action and government regulation. There's also the Kent State Massacre, the Kent State Incident. This major protest in Ohio was a part of the 1970 protests against the Vietnam War, even though President Nixon has vowed to reduce the troops. 4 student protesters are killed by the Ohio National Guard. This is an iconic photograph from the shootings that you should know. It's a pivotal moment in American history. Richard Nixon also really dismantled a lot of the Great Society programs, turning over the control of these programs to states and local officials. Nixon was not viewed as a friend of civil rights. Got to pause if you want any of this stuff. And Nixon also continued to fight stagflation. Even though the inflation had been growing since the 1960s, the economy was growing flat or stagnant during the 1970s. This created a real double problem of high inflation, but not a lot of economic growth, that President Nixon combated through deficit spending, to price freezes to reduce inflation. There's also going to be issues with oil and oil embargoes against the United States during Nixon's presidency and onward. So there's a lot of issues going on with the economy in Nixon's time period. There's also the Watergate scandal. Burglars come into the Democratic Party's national headquarters in June of 1972. They are caught, and the Nixon administration denies any knowledge, even though President Nixon initiates a cover-up, including hush money to the defendants. And this illegal cover-up of the Watergate break-in leads Nixon to not only bribe the defendants, but also authorize the CIA to try to prevent this investigation. This goes on into 1973, where the five Watergate criminals in the criminal trial are all found guilty. They're encouraged to cooperate with the Senate. It's revealed that Richard Nixon has tapes, audio recording tapes of everything that happens in the White House. So the Senate demands that President Nixon return the tapes for the investigation. He refuses, and this leads to a lot of clashes between Nixon, the investigation, and the Senate, and also leads to a real crisis of confidence, because not only is Nixon's approval rating plummeting while America is dealing with, is the president involved in this break-in and covering it up, but also Vice President Spiro Agnew, who was accused of tax evasion and bribery, leaves office in 1973. Eventually, Nixon is impeached, and when he does release the White House tapes, there's a gap in the testimony. The tapes still reveal, even with this gap, that Nixon was involved in covering up Watergate, even if we don't know for sure if he was involved in the break-in. So, in the summer of 1974, Nixon eventually decides to resign. It's determined that he will probably lose the criminal trial in the Senate, and so Nixon leaves office in 1974. This paves the way for a few efforts and then a new president. The 26th Amendment is going to be an aftermath of the Watergate scandal, which gives 18-year-olds the right to vote. There's also greater strengthening of the Freedom of Information Act, campaign financing, and campaign contribution limitations. An independent counsel will be set up for future special prosecutions, and there's going to be a growing distrust of the American government that's going to continue until today. Oh, we watched this in class. Then there's Gerald Ford. So President Gerald Ford was originally a congressional speaker who was appointed vice president as a replacement and president as a replacement. And the economy really is a major issue in Gerald Ford's presidency. The economy is very bad. There is still high unemployment and a recession now, as well as inflation. And there's going to be a continued crisis of confidence. Gerald Ford pardons Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon will not go to jail or face a criminal trial. And this pardoning of Richard Nixon is something that many Americans are controversial of Gerald Ford for forgiving Nixon's crimes. The stagflation continues of the 70s. Growth is down, inflation and unemployment are up. And there are many different efforts like interest rates, unemployment. Gerald Ford has a campaign called WIN, or Whip Inflation Now. This really is not able to address the core causes of inflation, especially like the price of oil is skyrocketing throughout the United States. These economic crises throughout the United States are worsened by the oil cartel cutting off oil to the United States. Gas prices soar and leads to greater stress and greater strain on Ford's campaign. The WIN program, or the Whip Inflation Now program, wanted to really restore public confidence in the economy. This was a an effort to have the public react to these different economic situations, and also have an anti-recession spending program. People were urged to save instead of spend, and this was really an effort to control inflation by addressing the public directly. But the War Powers Act is also officially in 1973. And then Jimmy Carter has the presidency because Ford was unable to answer the economic problems. Jimmy Carter is elected in the 1976 election, and here he goes, East and West this time, not North and South. The economy is still a real issue. There is still this gas price, this gas inflation. Fuel shortages are out of control. Oops. And there are some domestic efforts by President Jimmy Carter, but he's often really known for, again, trying to decrease inflation. None of these efforts work. There is a real crisis of confidence in America. What Carter calls a malaise in America. There really is also one other major effort is the amnesty for draft dodgers. Carter promises that people who skipped out or left the military service during the Vietnam War will be allowed back into the country without prosecution. There's also the Camp David Accords. This is a major win for the Carter administration. Carter oversees a series of negotiations and discussions between Egypt and Israel, who are in conflict over the Sinai Peninsula and over recognition of the state of Israel. And there had been many different wars as well. But Carter really brought these leaders together at Camp David in the United States to sign recognition of each other's countries and have Israel remove forces from the Sinai Peninsula. Carter was a hero of foreign policy until a revolution in Iran drew attention to another part of the Middle East. America had supported the Shah, dictator of Iran, and during the Iranian Revolution, 52 Americans were seized from the American embassy and held hostage for over 440 days. Carter tried economic threats, a rescue mission that failed, negotiation, but the hostages were held for over 444 days. It's really put another damper on Carter's presidency. He was ultimately defeated by Ronald Reagan in the upcoming presidential election, and Reagan becomes president in 1980. There's obviously a lot of worry in the country as well. Reagan is able to carry many of the states and the popular vote. So Ronald Reagan has an interesting life story. Here it is in part. He was an actor. He switched political parties. He runs for president. And in his first term, he has a couple things like the PATCO air traffic controllers strike. This is a strike where air traffic controllers seeking reductions in their work and also increased pay are essentially terminated by Ronald Reagan. Reagan does not want the airline industry to come to a halt, so he tells the air traffic controllers, you will go back to work or you'll be terminated. And over 11,000 air traffic controllers are fired by Reagan in his first term. There's also Reaganomics. This is, and there's more information here on the slide that we'll get into, this is really economic policies throughout the 1980s promoting tax cuts, free market capitalism, and deregulation of the economy. The supply side economics, sometimes criticized as trickle-down economics, emphasize tax cuts at the top to stimulate investment and growth. There's also the Star Wars campaign and a greater focus on the Cold War. There's also the Challenger explosion in 1986. And then there's the war on drugs. The war on drugs actually truly begins with Nancy Reagan, the First Lady's anti-drug campaign. There's a stronger drug enforcement bill. There are also military actions against countries that are supporting or facilitating the drug trade. And there's the Iran-Contra affair. There's also a scandal in Reagan's administration. Scandals for everybody. Going back to the Cold War, Reagan makes his famous Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall speech in 1987. And then in 1988, Republican George Bush becomes president. George Bush is responsible for signing the American with Disabilities Act in 1990. There have been a series of protests by Americans with disabilities. George Bush signs this law that enshrines the civil rights of Americans with different disabilities and difficulties, public access, no more discrimination. There are a lot of major efforts of the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, that are important until today. This is a good pause spot. There's also the Persian Gulf War. When Iraq and Saddam Hussein invade the smaller country of Kuwait, there is a United States and a United Nations initiative to counterattack Iraq. Operation Desert Storm, or the First Gulf War, sends many U.S. troops to a short and brief war in Iraq to assure the flow of human rights continuing. The Cold War and the Soviet Union end in 1991, but a promise George Bush made when he was running for president in 1988 was, read my lips, no new taxes. But despite this campaign promise, in 1990, George Bush signs a law raising taxes. Therefore, he is widely lambasted in the media and loses the next presidential election in 1992 to Democrat Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton sponsors a bill called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This is a policy allowing people of different sexualities to serve in the military as long as they don't disclose their sexual orientation. Previously, people of different sexualities had been investigated and kicked out of the military, but now, as long as they don't come out, they're allowed in the military. This unpopular practice is going to last almost 11 years. And there are also going to be a series of humanitarian and military interventions in the 1990s. Bosnia, Haiti, Somalia, I'd add Kosovo to this list. The United States and the United Nations are involved in different military interventions throughout the 1990s. You should have studied in global, including in Somalia. There's also NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1992. This is a trade agreement between America, Mexico, and Canada to stimulate the economic growth by taking down tariffs and really promoting trade between these three nations. There's a lot of stuff in NAFTA you can go into here. And President Clinton also signs the Welfare to Work bill. This overhauled the welfare system, emphasizing work requirements to stay on healthcare. You have to either seek jobs, job training, or find and apply to jobs to continue getting your welfare. There's like a whole nice slide on the benefits here. This program was criticized for dumping welfare funds into the states that then really could hold or withhold many of the welfare benefits. Bill Clinton is also impeached in 1998 for perjury and obstruction of justice. He is acquitted by the Senate for his scandal involving sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. Bill Clinton also manages to achieve a budget surplus. There is in you can actually see briefly 1998 until the year 2001, a brief time where the federal government brings in more money than it spends, but it's a brief time. Yes, this has to do with Clinton's budget. Yes, this also has to do with the economy is booming and tax revenue is booming and technology is booming. This really helps balance and then reach a surplus, but it's not long before government spending increases, taxes are cut, the economy slows down, and we go back into the millions and billions and now trillions of dollars of government debt that we know so well in America. Then, I feel like I missed something. Nope. Then in 2000, there was a contested election. George W. Bush, son of former President George H.W. Bush, runs against Al Gore. And this incredibly close election comes down to the state of Florida. Whoever wins the state of Florida will win the presidency, and that's why in November of the year 2000, nobody knows who's going to be the president because they're still counting votes and recounting votes and examining votes. And this is on TVs through all of November into December of the year 2000, when Al Gore finally steps down and acknowledges that George Bush should be the president. There's then the September 11th terrorist attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. These terrorist attacks prompt the United States to become much more involved in the global war on terror. The war on terror will target several countries like Afghanistan, other countries in addition to Iraq, and this will also lead to the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the creation of the Patriot Act. I have some information here on the Patriot Act. This is a lot of information. You should probably pause as you go through this. There are going to be new avenues for investigations, phone, email, library records. The government's reports can be filed away for long periods of time, or incredibly long periods of times. And they can use this Patriot Act to find out other things. The ACLU doesn't like the Patriot Act, but hey, you need to come up with your own opinion. The Taliban and Saddam Hussein are targets of this war on terror. There's also the No Child Left Behind Act. This 2002 legislation revamps the education system. It really provides grades for schools based on federal funding. Schools, depending on how they do on standardized tests, will receive or lose federal funding. This act is widely criticized for resulting in too many tests that really might slow or hurt schools and students. Then Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. He passes the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. This was really an extension of the Civil Rights Act for women. It allows employees to seek damages for wage discrimination every time discriminatory practices occurs, firing, being passed over, or not promoted as highly as others based off of gender. It's largely using Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act of 2010 is a major healthcare reform, expanding healthcare access. In addition to your employer's coverage, you can buy or seek healthcare coverage through private affiliations and online vendors. Obamacare continues to be controversial, and it's up to you to decide. You should then find some information on the final two presidents, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Okay, hopefully this video was good for you. Let us know what you thought. We'll see you later.